In a courtroom ruled by arrogance and bias, silence was mistaken for weakness. But one woman's calm brilliance was about to rewrite the rules. This is not just a story of justice, it's a masterclass in dignity. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs, its high ceilings and cold marble echoing every sound like a silent warning. At the far end, the judge sat perched above the room, draped in a black robe, his chin tilted in faint arrogance, eyes skimming the papers before him with bored disinterest. His bench towered over the proceedings, a symbol of authority that seemed to delight him more than it should. The heavy doors creaked open, and a woman stepped inside. She was modestly dressed, holding a thin, worn file close to her chest. Her steps were measured, her eyes steady, her face unreadable. She looked like someone who had never belonged to a courtroom, someone who had walked in from another world, a world quieter, gentler, and far removed from the sharp edges of legal warfare. At the plaintiff's bench, the opposing lawyer leaned back with theatrical ease, his voice rising above the murmurs as he exchanged jokes with the judge. They laughed, too loud, too familiar. It wasn't the first time they'd shared that courtroom, and it showed. The lawyer's suit was bright, his tie louder than necessary, and his confidence filled the space like smoke. The judge finally called the court to order and skimmed the case summary. A civil dispute, minor in nature, on paper. A disagreement about property rights and a small business contract. Nothing sensational, nothing that warranted the spotlight. The judge sighed dramatically, already annoyed that it had reached his bench. He glanced over at the woman and raised an eyebrow. "Are you nervous?" he asked, his tone dipped in sarcasm. "Try not to waste the court's time." A few people chuckled quietly. The court clerk shifted uncomfortably, stealing a glance at the woman with something between pity and apology. She nodded once and spoke, her voice calm and even. "I'd like to proceed, Your Honor." The judge leaned back in his chair and waved a dismissive hand. "Go ahead, let's get this over with," he said, already looking past her. Around her, the courtroom remained tense but uninterested. To them, she was an amateur, a woman clearly out of her depth. But as she opened her file and placed a single page on the podium, there was something different in her silence, something steady, like a storm not yet arrived. The woman began to present her case with quiet precision. Her voice, though soft, carried a firmness that demanded attention. She outlined her points methodically, referring to clauses, dates, and terms with clear intent. Yet every few sentences, the judge cut in, not to seek clarity, but to undermine. He asked irrelevant questions, twisted her words into jokes, and phrased his interruptions with barely concealed sarcasm. "Are you reading that from a website?" he asked at one point, smirking as a few in the courtroom chuckled. "This isn't a college debate." She paused only to breathe, never reacting. Her eyes didn't flinch, and her hands never trembled. As she attempted to submit a piece of evidence, a dated email chain showing misrepresentation, the judge sighed dramatically and leaned forward. "Miss, this isn't how it's done. You're clearly in over your head." He rolled his eyes before turning to the opposing counsel. "Help her out, would you? Unless she's hoping to learn procedure on the job." The lawyer, emboldened by the judge's tone, laughed loudly. "She's probably a Google lawyer," he said, shaking his head. "Reads 2 blogs and thinks she's Ruth Bader Ginsburg." The courtroom joined in the amusement. Only the clerk looked uneasy, glancing up from her notes to study the woman's still face. Meanwhile, the opposing counsel strutted through his presentation with full freedom, spinning narratives without interruption, submitting exhibits without question, straying from facts into theater. The judge nodded along, even chuckled once. In contrast, every step the woman took was monitored, every formality questioned. When she spoke again, the judge interrupted mid-sentence to correct her tone. When she cited a regulation, he asked her to quote the exact paragraph or move on. Her grace never cracked. Her answers stayed calm. Her posture remained upright. But the tension in the room had shifted. It was no longer amusement. It was disbelief that she kept standing. After nearly 20 minutes of constant obstruction, she looked up and requested a brief recess. The judge smirked, tapping his pen against the desk. "Of course, if you need time to regroup, by all means." He waved his hand like brushing away dust. She turned and exited the courtroom without a word. In the hallway, away from the noise, she leaned against the cool marble wall and opened her notes. No panic, no frustration, just strategy. She flipped to a specific page she had bookmarked. Her next move wasn't emotional. It was precise, calculated, and ready. When the recess ended, the courtroom resumed with a subtle but noticeable shift in the air. The woman re-entered with the same calm expression, the same modest file in hand, but something was different, something no one could name yet. She approached the podium, opened to a marked page, and began speaking. Her voice was steady as ever, but now it carried weight. She cited a statute, obscure, tucked deep within an outdated section of civil code. The judge frowned, clearly unfamiliar. "That's not relevant here," he said dismissively. She paused, nodded respectfully, and asked, "May I read a precedent into the record?" The judge hesitated, then waved his hand. Briefly. She read, just a few lines, from a ruling made years ago in a similar case, handled by a higher court. Her delivery was precise, each word deliberate. Slowly, she began to draw connections, showing how the statute applied directly, how it exposed a flaw in the opposing argument that no one had caught. The courtroom fell silent. As she spoke, her logic unfolded like a carefully drawn map. She layered facts over timelines, pointed to contradictions in affidavits that had previously gone unchallenged. Her voice never rose, but her words landed like stones. The clerk looked up from her papers, eyebrows slightly raised. Even those in the gallery leaned forward, sensing the shift. The judge shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He wanted to interrupt, but couldn't. Every point she made was rooted in law, meticulously supported and impossible to refute without revealing ignorance. A sheen of sweat began to form on his forehead beneath the warm court lights. She presented time-stamped emails, dated receipts, and procedural records showing that the opposing counsel had filed documents out of order, bypassing proper review. Then came the loophole, a missed clause that undermined the very foundation of their claim. The opposing counsel rose abruptly, objecting to her interpretation. But the judge, now forced to actually look at the law she cited, skimmed the text and cleared his throat. "Overruled," he muttered, eyes narrowed. The murmurs began. Low, uncertain at first, then louder, filled with surprise. This woman, this quiet, dismissed figure, was dismantling the case piece by piece. The opposing lawyer sat back, face flushed, suddenly silent. The judge leaned forward, no longer amused, no longer smirking. He reached for the file she'd submitted earlier and began reading, really reading, for the first time. The courtroom was no longer hers to survive. It was hers to command. The courtroom held its breath as the judge, his composure unraveling, leaned slightly forward and asked the woman to clarify a final technical point regarding the chain of custody on the documents she had presented. She didn't flinch. Her response was clear, direct, and unshakably accurate. She recited the procedural timeline without notes, closing the gap with a final detail that tied her entire case together. There was no hesitation in her voice, no stumble in her logic. The judge sat back, lips pressed thin. The opposing counsel stood quickly, throwing out a last-ditch argument, something about context, about ambiguity in the statute she had used. But before he could build momentum, the woman raised her hand slightly, waiting for silence. Then she spoke, not louder, but with unmistakable finality. She quoted a counter-precedent, one that directly addressed his point and crushed it entirely. The case he had referenced had already been overturned. She knew it. He didn't. Silence followed, thick and total. The judge looked down, then cleared his throat. He straightened the stack of papers in front of him, adjusted his robe, and spoke in a tone that tried to remain neutral, but cracked with reluctant respect. He ruled in her favor. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "Impressive presentation. You clearly have a surprising legal acumen." It was not an apology, but it was all he could offer. The woman nodded once. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, her voice as even as it had been all day. She closed her file, placed the papers neatly inside, and stepped away from the podium. The gallery moved aside as she passed, silent now, no longer dismissive. At the back of the room, a young woman with a notepad, clearly a student, hurried after her. She caught up just as they exited the heavy courtroom doors. "Are you a lawyer?" she asked, awe and confusion mingling in her voice. The woman glanced at her, a faint smile touching her lips. "No," she said softly. "Just someone who did her homework." Inside the courtroom, the judge remained seated, staring at the closed door. His eyes drifted back to the file she had left on the record. His fingers tapped it once, then stopped. The smirk that had never quite left his face was gone now, replaced by something else, something quieter, something that almost looked like respect.